Imagine you go to sleep in a normal world, and when you open your eyes the next morning, the person lying beside you is already cold. This is not a horror story. This was the reality that millions of Europeans had to live through in the mid-14th century. They called it the Black Death. We call it the greatest tragedy humanity has ever witnessed. Florence, a spring morning in 1348. Antonio, a shoemaker, woke up with an unusual chill. He felt under his armpit something was swelling, hard and painful. In the candlelight, his wife saw black-purple swellings, just like the neighbors who died last week. She knew what it meant. 48 hours later, that house fell silent. 7 people. No survivors. This story was not an exception. It happened simultaneously in thousands of other homes across Florence, across Italy, across Europe. In the next 30 minutes, we'll journey through the most terrifying period in human history, from the desolate Mongolian steppes where the disease originated to the city of Kaffa where the first biological weapon was created, to the great cities as they collapsed one by one. And most importantly, you'll see the lessons our ancestors paid for with 200 million lives. Because those empty streets, those locked doors, that invisible fear in the air, all of that is not just distant history, it has returned to us. To understand why the Black Death was so devastating, we must understand the world before it arrived. In 1340, 8 years before the catastrophe, Europe was at the height of its history. If you were a Venetian merchant in 1340, you were living in a golden age. You stood at the Rialto docks, heart pounding as ships from the east came to port. Silk from China so fine that light could pass through it. Spices from India, pepper, cloves, cinnamon. Porcelain from Jingdezhen, delicate and exquisite. Everything had traveled 5,000 kilometers from Beijing through Samarkand, through Baghdad to reach your hands. This wasn't just trade, this was medieval globalization. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, had created a safe transcontinental trade route from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. A merchant could carry a golden passport and travel from one end of the known world to the other without harassment. Paris in 1340 had 200,000 inhabitants, the largest city in Europe. The Sorbonne University attracted the brightest minds from across the continent. Notre Dame Cathedral was nearly complete, its massive stained glass windows creating magical displays of light inside. Florence was the financial center, where banks lent money to kings. Europe's population had nearly doubled in 3 centuries, from 40 million to 75 million. Thanks to the medieval warming period, harvests were abundant. Cities burst beyond their old walls. This was an optimistic world that believed each generation would live better than the last. But all this prosperity had created an unprecedented network of connections, and that was exactly what would kill it. Because while Europe was at its peak, thousands of kilometers to the east, an ancient killer had just awakened. The Central Asian steppes, the border of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and China, the year 1330, a sea of yellow, dry grass stretching to the horizon. The wind blew cold, winter dropped to -40 degrees, summer rose to 40 above. This was a land of extremes. But this place was not desolate. Underground, in tunnels 3 meters deep, lived millions of marmots and ground squirrels. And in their bodies, in their blood and lymph nodes, lived a bacterium that had co-evolved with them for millions of years, Yersinia pestis. Under a microscope, it looks like a tiny sausage, but this is one of the deadliest bacteria nature has ever created. Its mechanism is incredibly sophisticated. When a flea bites an infected rodent, the bacteria creates a biological mass that blocks the flea's stomach. The flea becomes desperate, biting more and more aggressively. Each bite transmits thousands of bacteria to a new host. For many centuries, this was a normal ecological balance, but in the 1330s, the balance was broken. A prolonged drought caused marmots to migrate near human settlements, and at the rest stops along the Silk Road, two species of rodents met: wild marmots and house rats, species that had lived with humans for thousands of years. Fleas jumped from marmots to house rats, and house rats, having no immunity, died in droves. But before dying, they traveled in carts, in grain sacks, on ships carrying silk. Imagine a trading caravan departing from Samarkand in 1338. 50 merchants, 200 camels. In the grain sacks hid 40 rats. In their fur, hundreds of fleas. In the fleas' bellies, millions of bacteria. The first week, a merchant developed a fever. His neck swelled with egg-sized lumps full of pus and blood. He died after 3 days. The second week, 3 more people. The third week, 10 people. By the time the caravan reached Kaffa after 6 months, only 15 people survived. But the rats, they were still there, and they were about to board ships. Kaffa, Crimean Peninsula, 1346. This was no ordinary city. This was Genoa's massive trading fortress with stone walls 6 meters thick, 15 meters high. 70,000 people lived inside, a vibrant economic center where Asia and Europe met. Autumn 1346, Khan Janibeg's army besieged the city, a massive force of nearly 100,000 warriors. The siege dragged on month after month. The Genoese had enough food for a year and controlled the port. This was the perfect stalemate. But then, in early 1347, something began happening in the Mongol camp. A few soldiers fell ill. Swellings appeared under their armpits. Within days, they died. At first, just a few people, then 10 per day, then 50, then hundreds. The camps became morgues. Once strong warriors lay moaning, bodies covered with black-purple swellings, blood flowing from their mouths. Khan Janibeg saw his army disintegrating, and in desperation, he had a terrible idea. If this disease was killing his army, why not let it kill the enemy? The order was given: collect the corpses of soldiers who died from the plague. The decomposing bodies were loaded into trebuchets, giant catapults, and under the March sun of 1347, history witnessed the first biological weapon. Corpses flying through the air, over the 15-meter walls, falling into the merchant quarter. For days on end, the sky over Kaffa rained corpses. People panicked. City officials ordered all bodies collected and thrown into the sea. But it was too late. Workers had boarded the ships, they had touched the ropes, and most importantly, the rats had come ashore, using the mooring ropes to climb down to the docks. 3 days later, the first case appeared: a dock worker, his wife, 2 children. Within a week, 50 cases. Within 2 weeks, 500 cases. Messina descended into chaos. The speed of transmission was horrifying. Narrow streets, wooden houses built close together, each family 6 to 8 people sharing one room, crowded markets, shared wells, and rats everywhere, in walls, basements, food storage. No one knew these small creatures were carrying death. The plague spread in a predictable pattern. The port area fell first. One person got sick. Within days, the whole family infected. Neighbors came to visit. They got infected. Doctors came to examine.
they got infected. Priests came to pray, they got infected. Within 2 months, Messina lost 40% of its population, 20,000 people. Survivors fled. They ran to mountain villages. They ran to Palermo. They boarded ships to the mainland, and many carried the disease with them. From Messina, ships spread throughout the Mediterranean. Marseille in France, Venice, Genoa, Barcelona. Each port became a new infection center. By the end of 1348, the entire Mediterranean coast was infected. The sea that had been a source of life became a source of death. But the plague didn't stop at ports. It moved deep inland, along Roman roads, on river barges, in merchant wagon trains. Florence, spring 1348, a city of 120,000 people facing hell.
Giovanni Boccaccio, a writer who lived through this period, left haunting testimony. A terrible plague arrived. No human wisdom, no measures could oppose it. Humble prayers were sent to God, not just once, but many times. All were useless. Let's follow the Albizzi family. Francesco, the wool merchant, his wife, Caterina, 4 children from 8 to 18 years old, an elderly mother, 3 servants. 10 people in a 4-story palazzo near Santa Croce. Early April, the young servant Lucia went to market. In the crowd, someone was coughing. Droplets of saliva flew through the air. Fleas jumped onto her clothes. 3 days later, Lucia had a fever. Madonna Caterina herself cared for her, wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Contact with fluid from the bursting swellings. Lucia died after 4 days. Caterina developed a fever the next day. Francesco called the best doctor. The doctor came, wearing a long robe, holding a wooden stick to examine from a distance. Diagnosis: bubonic plague, incurable. But the doctor still tried. He bled her to balance the humors. The woman, already weakened by fever, now weaker from blood loss. He lanced the swellings to release the toxins. Pus and blood spilled out, bacteria spreading throughout the room. Caterina died after 2 days of agony. Then the 12-year-old daughter, the 15-year-old son, Francesco himself. When Francesco tried to call for help, no one came. The neighbors on the right, all dead. On the left, fled. The parish priest died last week. Boccaccio wrote, "Brothers abandoned brothers, uncles abandoned nephews, wives abandoned husbands, and more terrible, parents abandoned children as if they were not their own." In the Albizzi family, only 2 survived. The 18-year-old eldest son who had fled when he saw his father sick, and the 8-year-old youngest daughter, for some reason, never developed symptoms. 8 out of 10 people dead within 2 weeks. This story multiplied thousands of times across Florence. Signs of collapse were everywhere. Shops closed, churches both full and empty. Full because people came to pray, empty because priests died. Cemeteries overflowed. Mass burial pits were dug, trenches 10 meters deep, 20 meters wide, bodies stacked in layers, corpses, lime, then corpses again. Church bells rang continuously until authorities banned them for causing panic. The city fell into silence, only the sound of carts carrying corpses rolling on cobblestones. By September, the worst wave passed, not because they found a cure, simply because there weren't enough people left to spread it. Florence began with 120,000 people, ended with 50,000. 70,000 people, nearly 60%, had died. But Florence was not unique. Paris, London, Venice, Barcelona all experienced similar tragedies.
And while cities at least had doctors and government, 90% of the population living in rural areas faced something worse: complete disappearance. Let's go to the small village of Asheville in central England. 200 people, 43 families. Thomas, the gravedigger, 52 years old, had buried the dead for this village for 30 years. In a normal year, he buried 8 to 10 people. Summer 1348, Thomas's work changed forever. The plague arrived via a traveling peddler. 3 days later, the innkeeper had a fever. 5 days later, the entire family of 4 dead. Funeral attendees were exposed. Within 3 weeks, 15 people dead. 6 weeks, 50 people. 2 months, 120 people, more than half of the village. Thomas dug from dawn to dusk, but there was no more room in the cemetery. He began digging large pits. 5 people in 1 pit, 10 people. Then he stopped counting. Father Benedict, the priest, died in early September. No other priest within 20 miles. Then people began to flee. Young families packed up and left at night. Blacksmiths, carpenters sought work elsewhere. By mid-October, Asheville was nearly completely abandoned. Of 200 people, only 12 survived. 180 people, 90% gone. Thomas was one of the 12. He stood in the cemetery surrounded by new graves. He had buried the entire village: wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, everyone he ever knew. He lived another 3 years alone in the ghost village, then died in his sleep. No one buried him. Asheville was never resettled. Houses collapsed. Grass grew through floors. Within 20 years, no sign that 200 people had once lived here. This story multiplied thousands of times. England alone had 2,000 to 3,000 completely deserted villages. When science failed, people turned to religion, and when religion also failed, desperation gave birth to monsters. Paris, October 1348. The Sorbonne Medical Council, 48 of the best scholars reached a conclusion. The cause was the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars on March 20th, 1345. The planets created toxic vapors from the Earth that corrupted the 4 humors in the body. The solution? Bloodletting, vomiting, purging, lancing swellings. Each method only made patients weaker, but doctors didn't know. They believed they were helping. When prayer was useless, extreme movements emerged. The flagellants, people who whipped themselves. Hundreds of men wearing identical white robes walked barefoot across Germany. Each day, twice, they formed a circle, stripped to the waist, and whipped themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. 33 minutes, 1 minute for each year of Jesus' life, they whipped without stopping. Backs became masses of torn flesh, blood flowing down legs, pooling on stone. They believed by bearing suffering, they were bearing the community's sins, and God would stop the plague. But even darker, searching for a scapegoat. When no explanation satisfied, people needed someone to blame. And in a society full of prejudice, one group became the target: the Jews. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells, working for the devil, trying to exterminate Christianity. Completely absurd. Jews were dying at the same rate. The Pope declared the rumors false, but logic didn't matter to a frightened mob.
January 1349, Basel. 600 Jews were locked in a wooden house on an island in the Rhine River. The mob set it on fire. Horrible screams as hundreds of people burned alive. Those who tried to escape were pushed back with long poles. On February 14, 1349, Valentine's Day, Strasbourg massacred 2,000 Jews. They were given a choice: convert or die. The vast majority refused.
They sang hymns, embraced each other, prayed, then were burned alive. After the Jews died, the mob looted their houses for gold and silver. Debts owed to Jewish creditors? Voided. People paid their debts by killing their creditors. Throughout German-speaking regions, Mainz 6,000 killed, Cologne 5,000, Erfurt 3,000. It's estimated that between 1348 and 1351, about 200 Jewish communities were destroyed, perhaps 100,000 people killed. Many massacres occurred in places where the plague hadn't even arrived, people killed out of fear of what might come. The year 1351, the worst wave passed. Europe was still there, devastated, wounded, having lost half its population, but still there. And from the ashes, something new began to sprout. In 1351, the peasant John walked into Lord Ashford's office. Before the plague, the manor had 87 serf families, 400 people. Now, 23 families, 100 people, 75% of the workforce gone. Lord Ashford couldn't farm all his land. John made a bold proposal. I'll work more, but I want to work only 2 days per week instead of 4, reduce tax from 1/3 to 1/5, and double wages. If you don't agree, I'll go to another village. They're paying more. This was rebellion. 5 years earlier, John would have been imprisoned, possibly whipped. But now, if Lord Ashford refused, John could simply flee. Who would pursue him when most guards were dead, and other lords would hide him because they too desperately needed labor? Lord Ashford realized power no longer belonged to him. For the first time in many centuries, power belonged to the worker. Agreed, he said, wearily. This conversation repeated thousands of times across Europe. This was one of the greatest economic social revolutions in history. Real wages in England increased nearly 200% in one generation. But it wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. Gradually, the serf system, which had defined Europe for centuries, began to collapse. In 1381, tensions exploded in the Peasants' Revolt. 60,000 peasants marched to London asking, when Adam dug and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The revolt was suppressed, but the message was clear. The old times were dead. You could kill the rebels, but you couldn't kill economic reality. Through the 15th century, serfdom disappeared in most of Western Europe. Art changed. The danse macabre, dance of death, appeared. Skeletons dancing with the Pope, king, knights, peasants. The message? Death doesn't discriminate. Whether rich or poor, in the end, you dance with death. Literature changed. Boccaccio's Decameron, 10 people self-isolating, telling stories, was not solemn morality, but humorous, bawdy about humans, written in Italian instead of Latin. Chaucer did the same with Canterbury Tales in English. This was the precursor to the Renaissance humanism. The church trembled. When priests died at the same rate as sinners, when no miracles occurred, many people doubted. The shortage of priests forced the church to lower standards. This eroded moral authority, contributing to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Medicine progressed. The Black Death proved ancient texts weren't perfect. Some doctors began to doubt, observing reality instead of just reading old books. More practically, quarantine. Venice developed 40-day isolation. Lazarettos, isolation hospitals, awareness of contagion. By the early 14th century, a new Europe emerged. Workers had power. Serfdom died. Women had opportunities. Art focused on humans. Vernacular languages replaced Latin. The church weakened. Scientific awareness replaced dogma. Ideas of equality spread. All of this culminated in the late 15th and early 16th centuries with the Italian Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the Printing Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. Not all of this was directly caused by the Black Death, but the plague shattered the old world to the point where a new world could emerge. It killed serfdom, weakened the church, forced innovation, encouraged doubt, created social mobility. In a sense, the modern world was born from the ashes of the Black Death. The price? 200 million dead. Villages disappeared, families shattered, orphaned children, psychological scars, loss of faith, terrible violence against Jews, collapse of social order. Was the progress worth it? An unanswerable question. History has no counterfactuals. We don't know whether Europe would have achieved the same progress without catastrophe. What we do know, humanity has remarkable resilience. Even from the worst catastrophe, society rebuilt. Not the same as before, but something new, sometimes better. And now, in 2025, looking back from 700 years later, don't those empty streets sound familiar? Fear of the air, closed borders, conspiracy theories blaming outsiders, supply chain collapse, debates about science versus faith? COVID-19 is not the Black Death, much milder. We have modern medicine, but the psychological structure is similar, a global pandemic challenging how we live. The Black Death teaches us pandemics will happen. They devastate not just bodies, but social structures. Global connection is a double-edged sword. In a crisis, humans are capable of both heroic sacrifice and atrocity. Society can collapse faster than we think, but we can also rebuild, sometimes better. The only question, have we learned? Our ancestors paid the price of 200 million lives to learn quarantine, isolation, public health. They learned that in a connected world, a plague anywhere is a threat everywhere. They learned that prejudice and scapegoating only make things worse. Have we remembered those lessons, or have we forgotten, ready to learn them again the hard way? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and if we listen carefully enough, we can hear the echoes of footsteps from 1348, the sound of survivors stepping out of the ruins, looking around at a forever changed world and deciding to rebuild. The question for our generation, when the next crisis comes, and it will come, what will we build? The Black Death was the greatest civilization ever faced. It killed half of Europe, destroyed social order, shook faith in God and humanity. But from the ashes, a new world was born. A world with more freedom, more doubt, more humanism. The modern world, with all its flaws and achievements, has its roots in that dark period. So next time the streets are empty, hospitals are full, when you fear the future, remember Florence 1348. Remember the deserted villages. Remember the 200 million dead. And then remember that humanity survived. We rebuilt. We learned. We moved forward. We can do it again if needed, but it's better to learn from history so we don't have to. Thank you for following this journey through the greatest catastrophe in human history. Remember the past so we can create a better future. See you again in history.